It was one of those evenings when the restaurant glowed with warm lights and soft chatter filled the air. Expensive perfume, clinking glasses, and gentle laughter from well-dressed guests created a world that looked almost perfect from the outside. The place was known for its luxury and service, and a spot where the city's richest people came to show off their wealth and enjoy the finest meals. Among the waiters rushing around that night was a young woman with tired eyes and a calm smile. She moved quietly between tables, careful not to bump into anyone. She carried plates with steady hands and spoke in a polite voice whenever a guest called her over. Most of the time, no one really noticed her. To them, she was just part of the staff, someone meant to serve and disappear. But behind that quiet face lived a story no one could imagine. She worked here 6 days a week, often standing for hours cleaning tables, serving drinks, and pretending to smile when customers treated her badly. She didn't complain. Every tip mattered, every shift counted, because she wasn't just working for herself. At home, her mother was sick and needed medicine that wasn't cheap. So she worked longer hours, skipping meals sometimes just to save money. There was one thing, though, that made her different from everyone else in that restaurant. She had a secret love. A love that had once been her dream before life pushed it aside. That love was music. When she was younger, her father had an old upright piano. It stood in a corner of their small home, scratched and slightly out of tune, but it was her favorite thing in the world. She used to sit at it for hours, pressing the keys until her fingers hurt. Her father used to tell her that her hands were made for music, and she believed him. Back then, she dreamed of becoming a pianist, someone who could move people's hearts with sound. But dreams are fragile when reality hits. After her father passed away, everything changed. Her mother fell ill, bills piled up, and she had no choice but to find work. College became impossible, and the piano lessons stopped. She sold her old keyboard to pay rent and started working wherever she could, cleaning, waiting tables, doing anything that would bring a little money home. Still, the love for music never left her. Late at night, when the streets were quiet and her mother slept, she'd take out an old keyboard she had borrowed from a neighbor and play softly so no one would wake up. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine herself on a real stage again, not as a waitress but as a musician. Yet every morning, reality returned. She'd put on her uniform, tie her hair, and return to the restaurant where no one knew who she really was. That evening was no different. At least it didn't seem so at first. The restaurant was busier than usual because a special event was taking place. Some of the city's wealthiest people were hosting a private dinner there. The tables were covered with white cloth. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers, and the staff had been told to be on their best behavior. The young waitress moved carefully through the crowd, carrying trays of appetizers and drinks. She could hear bits of conversations about money, new businesses, and expensive vacations, topics far from her world. She kept her eyes down and focused on her work. At one table, a group of guests complained about their wine being a little too warm. She apologized quickly, took it back, and replaced it without argument. That was how she survived, by staying calm and polite no matter what. At the corner of the restaurant near the stage stood a grand piano. Its surface shone under the soft light, and beside it sat an older pianist who had been hired for the evening. His music floated gently through the air, smooth, classy, and comforting. The waitress couldn't help glancing at him from time to time. Her heart always fluttered a little whenever she heard piano music. It reminded her of everything she once wanted to be. Sometimes, between serving tables, she would pause for just a second near the stage. Not long enough for anyone to notice, just enough to catch a few notes and let them sink into her heart. The music gave her strength. It reminded her that somewhere inside, she was still that girl who believed in dreams. When the pianist took a short break, she found herself near the piano again. She ran her fingers along its edge, feeling the smooth wood. It felt strange, like touching a piece of her past. She wanted so badly to sit down and play just one note, but she couldn't. This was not her place. She was a waitress now, not a performer. The pianist returned, and she stepped back quickly, embarrassed at her own thoughts. She returned to her work, moving quietly through the tables once again. As the night went on, the atmosphere grew louder. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of roasted food filled the air. The waitress tried to stay focused, though her legs ached and her hands were tired. She noticed how easily the guests laughed, how they ordered expensive dishes without looking at the prices. To them, this was just another night. To her, it was another shift she had to survive. But still, she didn't let bitterness enter her heart. She had learned long ago that kindness and patience mattered, even when life wasn't fair. Sometimes a guest would smile back or thank her sincerely, and that small act was enough to make her feel human again. By the time the clock passed 10, she was exhausted. Her apron was stained from a spilled drink and her back hurt from standing too long. But she couldn't rest yet. The event wasn't over. The manager had asked all staff to stay until the last guest left. She nodded without complaint and kept going. Every now and then her eyes drifted to the piano again. The pianist played beautifully, but in her heart, she could almost hear the songs she used to play, the ones she had written herself when she was younger. Those songs carried pieces of her story, pieces that no one had ever heard. As the evening continued, she wondered what it would feel like to sit there again, to let her fingers touch the keys, to feel the sound flow through her. But she quickly pushed the thought away. Dreams like that didn't belong in her world anymore. She had bills to pay. She had her mother waiting at home. She couldn't afford to dream. Still, something inside her whispered. A small voice she had ignored for years. It said maybe one day. That night, as she cleaned a table near the stage, her reflection caught in the polished piano lid. For a moment, she saw herself not in her waitress uniform, but in a simple gown, sitting under the spotlight, her hands dancing across the keys. The image was so clear it almost felt real. Then someone called her name and the vision broke. She turned, smiled politely, and hurried back to work. The restaurant continued to buzz with laughter and music, but somewhere in that corner, behind the tired eyes of a quiet waitress, a spark still lived, small but strong. A spark that had once been a dream, and though no one knew it yet, that dream was waiting for its chance to rise again. The next evening arrived faster than she expected. The restaurant staff was already preparing for another busy night, but this time, it wasn't just any dinner service. A special event was planned, a grand charity gathering hosted by one of the city's richest families. The owners had been talking about it for weeks. Everyone knew it was important because the restaurant's reputation depended on nights like this. By 6 o'clock, the place was already glowing with golden lights. The tables were covered with white cloths, silver cutlery, and candles that flickered gently. Expensive cars lined up outside, and one by one, the guests began walking in, men in fine suits, women in elegant dresses, wearing jewels that sparkled under the lights. The waitress watched them quietly as she placed glasses on the tables. She had seen rich people before, but nights like this always made her feel a strange kind of distance. It wasn't jealousy. It was more like she lived in a world they could never see. She served them, smiled at them, but they would never really notice her. To them, she was just another face in a uniform. Still, she did her job with care. She adjusted plates, filled water glasses, and moved quickly from one table to another. The manager's voice kept echoing through the kitchen. "Keep the service smooth tonight." "No mistakes!" Everyone nodded, nervous but focused. In the corner of the room, the grand piano sat waiting. The same pianist who had played the night before was scheduled to perform again. His soft music usually filled the room, adding class and calmness to the fancy setting. Guests loved it. But that evening, as everyone rushed to prepare, something unexpected happened. Just half an hour before the event began, the pianist got a phone call. His face turned pale as he spoke quietly into the phone. Then, without a word to anyone, he quickly packed up his sheet music and left. The manager ran after him, asking what was going on. The man simply said his wife had been taken to the hospital. It was an emergency. Then he was gone. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The guests had already started arriving, and the music that usually greeted them was missing. The room felt strangely empty without it. The sound of laughter and conversation echoed awkwardly. The manager's face turned red as he whispered to one of the waiters, "Find someone, anyone who can play something." But of course no one could. The waitress stood nearby, holding a tray of drinks. She had heard everything. Her heart started beating faster. She looked at the piano, shining under the light, silent and alone. She felt a pull, like something deep inside her was waking up. But she stayed still. She told herself not to even think about it. The guests began to notice the silence. Some looked around impatiently. A few asked why the music had stopped. One woman laughed and said, What kind of place forgets to have music at an event like this? Others joined in, their laughter filled with judgment. The manager tried to smile and apologize, but it was clear the situation was getting tense. The waitress placed her tray down and stood in the corner, thinking. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from something else. Longing. The piano was right there, just a few steps away. She could play. She knew she could. But how could she, a waitress, just walk up there and sit at that piano in front of these people? It sounded impossible. She turned away, trying to focus on her work, but her heart wouldn't let her. Each time someone mentioned the missing music, she felt her chest tighten. She could almost hear the notes she wanted to play, the melody that had been sitting inside her for years. Finally, she took a deep breath and walked toward the manager. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, almost a whisper. "Sir," she said softly, "if you want, I can play for a while. Just until you find someone else." The manager looked at her as if he didn't understand. You play piano?" he asked, sounding unsure whether to laugh or believe her. She nodded. "A little. I used to play before I started working here. I can keep the guests calm until you find another pianist." The manager looked around, desperate. He had no other options. "Fine," he said after a pause. "Just don't mess it up. Keep it soft. If it doesn't sound right, stop immediately." She nodded again. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the piano. The sound in the room faded as people noticed her. Murmurs began to spread across the tables. "Is that the waitress?" Someone whispered. "What is she doing?" Another said. A few people chuckled quietly, expecting something ridiculous. She sat down slowly on the piano bench, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a moment she froze. It had been years since she'd played a real piano like this. What if she failed? What if they laughed at her? She closed her eyes. She thought of her father's voice, calm and kind, telling her that her hands were made for music. She remembered her mother's smile when she used to play softly in the evenings. She took a deep breath and let everything else disappear. Her fingers touched the keys. The first note was soft, almost shy. Then came another and another. Slowly the sound filled the room. Gentle at first, then warmer, fuller. The melody flowed like a quiet river, smooth and emotional. Conversation stopped. Glasses were set down. The laughter faded. No one had expected this. She didn't play any famous song. She played something of her own, a piece she had written long ago, back when her dreams were still alive. It was a melody that carried both sadness and hope. Each note felt like it came straight from her heart. The guests, who had been bored or amused a moment ago, now sat frozen in silence. The sound touched something deep inside them. It wasn't just music. It was emotion turned into sound, something they couldn't ignore. The waitress didn't look up. She didn't care who was watching. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about her uniform, her tired feet, or her empty wallet. She was lost in the music, free, alive herself. When the final note faded into silence, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. The room stayed quiet. Then suddenly someone clapped. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause, loud, genuine, amazed. The manager stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The guests who had laughed earlier now looked at her with wide eyes. Some smiled in disbelief. A few even stood up, clapping harder. She looked around, confused and emotional. She hadn't expected this. She gave a small, nervous smile and bowed her head slightly. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not as a waitress, but as someone who had something beautiful to share. That night, something changed. The silence that had once surrounded her was gone. The people who used to overlook her now wanted to know who she was. The manager came over later, still shaking his head in surprise. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said quietly. She just smiled, unsure what to say. All she knew was that for a few minutes that night, she had found her dream again, not in some faraway world, but right there, in the same place she had served drinks and wiped tables. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. After that night, the restaurant felt a little different. The staff talked about what had happened as if it were a dream. No one could believe that the quiet waitress, the one who spent her evenings cleaning tables, had sat at the piano and played like a professional. Some said it was luck. Others said it was pure talent. For her, it didn't feel real either. She woke up the next morning wondering if it had all been in her imagination. But then, when she arrived at work, people looked at her differently. The cook smiled and said, "You played beautifully last night." Even the manager, who usually kept his words short and strict, nodded at her with quiet respect. She smiled shyly, but deep down she was nervous. She didn't want too much attention. She hadn't played for praise. She had only wanted to help when the pianist left. Yet something had changed inside her. Something she couldn't ignore anymore. That moment at the piano had felt like life breathing into her again. It had been years since she had felt that kind of peace, that kind of joy. The sound of the keys under her fingers, the hush of the crowd, the music filling the air. It was something she couldn't forget. Still, she tried to go back to her usual routine. She served the guests, cleaned tables, and smiled when needed. But every time she passed the piano, her steps slowed. She couldn't help but look at it, remembering how it had felt to sit there. A few nights later, the restaurant had another busy evening. The pianist had returned and everything went as usual. The soft music played in the background, the guests chatted, and the staff rushed around. Yet even as she worked, she caught herself humming quietly to the same tune she had played before. The pianist noticed. During his short break, he walked over and said softly, "You've got talent. I heard about what you did that night." She blushed and shook her head. "I just filled in for a moment," she replied. But he smiled knowingly. "No, you didn't just fill in. You played from the heart. That's something even trained musicians forget." His words stayed with her long after he left. Maybe it wasn't just a random moment. Maybe it meant something more. A few days passed, and the memory of that evening started to fade from most people's minds. But not from hers. She found herself thinking about music all the time. When she walked home after her shift, she would tap rhythms on her bag or imagine melodies in her head. Her small apartment was quiet except for the sound of her mother's soft breathing in the next room. She often stayed awake at night sitting near the window, staring at the city lights. Sometimes she would whisper to herself, "What if I tried again? What if I could still be who I wanted to be?" But then reality would return. Bills, rent, medicine, long hours. Dreams didn't fit into her life anymore. One evening, something unexpected happened. A man who had been one of the guests during that charity event returned to the restaurant. He was well-dressed, confident, clearly someone with influence. When he recognized her serving his table, he smiled. "You're the one who played that night, right?" he asked. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir. Just for a little while." "I remember," he said. "It was remarkable." Everyone was talking about it the next day. She thanked him politely, not sure what else to say. Later that night, when the guests had left, the manager called her over. "That man was impressed," he said. "He asked about you. He wants you to play again tomorrow. There's another private dinner, and he requested that you be the one to perform for part of the evening." Her heart stopped for a second. "Me? But I'm not a professional musician," she said quickly. The manager shrugged. "He doesn't care. He said he wants the same girl who played with heart. If he's happy, that's good for the restaurant. So yes, you'll play again." That night she couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with mixed feelings, and fear, excitement, doubt, and hope all tangled together. What if she made a mistake this time? What if they regretted asking her? But another part of her whispered something else. What if this was a chance? The next evening, the restaurant was full again. The same wealthy man had brought a group of friends. The piano waited silently in the corner. She could feel the guests watching her as she walked past with trays and glasses. When the dinner settled and the manager nodded at her, she took a slow breath and approached the stage. Her hands trembled again, but she tried not to show it. The lights above were soft, golden, almost comforting. She sat at the piano, placed her fingers on the keys, and started to play. This time she didn't hold back. The melody that flowed out was warm and full, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The guests stopped talking just like before. Some leaned closer to listen. Her music carried something they couldn't explain. Emotion, honesty, a kind of beauty that didn't come from training but from real life, from struggle and love. Each note told a story of the girl who had worked hard all her life, who had given up her dream, and who was now finding it again in the most unexpected place. By the time she finished, the room was completely silent. Then came the applause, louder this time, filled with real admiration. The man who had requested her performance stood up and clapped with a proud smile. "You have a gift," he said loudly so everyone could hear. "Don't waste it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away and bowed her head. She didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from people like him. After that night, everything began to shift slowly. The manager, who once saw her only as a waitress, started asking her to play more often, especially during special dinners. Some guests even requested her by name. Every time she played, she felt more alive, more herself. But along with happiness came fear. What if it didn't last? What if the attention faded and she went back to being invisible again? She tried not to think too far ahead. Instead, she focused on each performance, each moment at the piano. She noticed something too. When she played, people changed. The same wealthy guests who often acted proud or distant would soften. They listened quietly, their faces calm, their eyes thoughtful. Her music made them feel something that money couldn't buy. And that to her was the most beautiful part of it all. Late one night, after everyone had left, she stayed behind for a few minutes, sitting at the piano in the empty restaurant. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She placed her hands on the keys and smiled. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with a voice, not through words but through music. She still didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt like it might hold something good. Something that belonged to her, and deep inside she knew. The night she walked to that piano hadn't been a mistake. It had been fate quietly opening a door she thought was closed forever. The evening had arrived, and the restaurant felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected on the polished floors, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with the aroma of fine dishes. Guests began arriving, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying themselves with confidence that came from wealth and habit. They laughed and talked in low tones, glancing around to see who was present, what arrangements had been made, and what they might order. The waitress moved among them, carrying trays with careful hands. Her heart beat a little faster than usual. Tonight felt different. She had been asked to play again, not just quietly, but in front of everyone in the middle of the dinner. She could see their expectations, though most didn't even know who she was. She tried to stay calm, reminding herself that this wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about letting the music flow, letting her story speak through sound. The manager gave her a small nod from across the room, signaling it was her time. She took a deep breath and walked toward the piano, her steps slow but steady. Conversation softened as people noticed her approach. A few glanced at each other, whispering, "Is she really going to play?" The waitress? Some smiled skeptically. Others shrugged, thinking it might be a small, simple piece to pass the time. No one could have imagined what was about to happen. She sat down at the bench and let her fingers hover above the keys. Her hands trembled slightly, but she pushed the fear aside. She thought of all the years she had spent dreaming, practicing alone, waiting for a moment like this. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices, of the nights she had stayed awake imagining this very stage, and then she played. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, but it immediately filled the room in a way that caught everyone's attention. A hush fell over the guests. Glasses stopped clinking, conversation ceased, and all eyes turned to her. She didn't lift her head. She let the music come from her heart, pouring all of her hope, fear, and longing into every note. It wasn't a simple melody. It was something alive, something that seemed to grow and flow with each passing second. Her fingers moved gracefully yet effortlessly, telling a story without words, the kind of story that people recognized even if they didn't know why it moved them so deeply. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the sound reach inside them. Others leaned forward, stunned by the skill and emotion pouring from the piano. The young woman played as if she had been born for this moment. Every note carried weight, every pause spoke of understanding and experience. She had learned over the years that music wasn't just about technique. It was about feeling, about connecting. And tonight she connected with everyone in the room. The wealthy guests, the manager, even the staff who had paused in their work to watch. A few of the richest guests, who often acted proud and untouchable, now sat leaning back in their chairs, mouths slightly open, eyes wide. They had spent their lives surrounded by luxury, always expecting to be impressed by money, by appearances, by status. But this was different. This was raw talent, something no amount of wealth could buy. And it stunned them completely. Some people felt tears forming in their eyes, although they quickly wiped them away. Others simply sat still, as if afraid to move and break the spell. The sound wrapped around the room like a warm blanket, softening faces and opening hearts. She didn't play to show off. She played because she had waited so long to feel alive, to touch something beyond her daily struggles. Time seemed to stretch. What felt like a few minutes was much longer. Her hands moved faster now, fingers dancing across the keys, filling the air with sound that felt almost magical. She had become one with the piano, letting it speak her story while she became invisible behind the music. Some guests whispered to each other, astonished. Where did she learn to play like that? I've never heard anything like it. Even the manager, standing a little off to the side, shook his head in disbelief. He had expected something simple, something polite, something that would fill the silence. He had not expected this, not at all. By the time the final notes approached, the room was completely silent. Every person felt suspended, hanging on the last sounds, not wanting them to end. And when the last note finally faded, there was a pause, a moment where no one breathed, where time seemed to stop entirely. Then came the applause. It started quietly, a single clap from someone near the front. But soon it grew, louder and louder, until the entire room was clapping, cheering, and some even standing. The wealthy guests, who had been skeptical and judgmental moments before, were now completely captivated. Their expressions had changed from amusement to awe. They were not just impressed. They were moved. The young woman rose slowly from the piano bench, overwhelmed but smiling. She had not expected such a reaction. She bowed her head slightly, her heart pounding. For a moment, she felt lightheaded from the intensity of it all. She had shared a piece of herself, a part of her that had long been hidden, and people had seen it. The man who had requested her performance earlier was standing near the back, clapping loudly. That was extraordinary, he said. Truly extraordinary. I have never seen anything like it. Even the pianist, who had left for an emergency the week before, had returned quietly to watch. He nodded at her with admiration. You didn't just fill in, he whispered. You owned it. She couldn't stop smiling, but there was also a tear rolling down her cheek. This was more than a performance. This was a moment where all the years of struggle, the endless shifts, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, and the quiet nights practicing alone had finally met recognition. Some guests came forward after the applause. They spoke softly, praising her talent, asking how she had learned, wanting to know more about the person behind the music. The usual walls of wealth and distance had disappeared. For a few minutes, she was no longer invisible. For a few minutes, she was the center of the room, not because of what she wore or how much money she had, but because of what she could do. Even the staff watched with astonishment. They had known her as a quiet, hard-working waitress, someone who never complained and always did her job. But now they saw her in a new light, not just as a coworker, but as a person capable of touching hearts and inspiring awe. The applause finally died down, leaving a lingering hum of excitement. She rose from the bench, hands still slightly trembling, and took a small bow. The room seemed brighter now, warmer, filled with a sense of possibility that had not been there before. The manager came over, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know how you did that, he said. I never imagined anyone could command a room like that. You changed everything tonight. She smiled shyly, trying to collect her thoughts. I just played, she said softly. No, he replied firmly. You did much more than that. You showed everyone what real talent looks like, and you reminded us that sometimes the people we least expect can amaze us the most. For the first time in years, she felt proud, not just for herself, but for every quiet moment she had spent working, dreaming, and hoping. The piano had given her a voice she never thought she could use in public. The audience had not just heard her music. They had felt it, and that made all the difference. As she stepped away from the stage and returned to her work, she realized something important. She had crossed a line she had once thought unthinkable. She had dared to share her hidden gift in a room full of people who could have ignored her, mocked her, or dismissed her entirely. Instead, they were moved. They were changed, and she was more alive than she had ever been. That night, she cleaned tables and refilled glasses, but her heart was full. She smiled quietly to herself, thinking about the look of astonishment on the faces of those who had watched her play. She had taken a step into a new world, a world where her talent mattered, where her music could reach others, and where her life could begin to change in ways she had only imagined in her dreams. For the first time in a long time, she believed that her future might hold more than struggle. It might hold music, recognition, and the chance to touch hearts, just as she had always hoped. And as the evening came to an end, and the wealthy guests left with whispered praises and lingering admiration, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After that unforgettable night at the piano, life began to change slowly but surely for the young waitress. The restaurant, which had once been just a place of work and survival, now felt like a bridge to something more, something she had only dreamed of for years. Word of her performance spread quickly. Some guests had recorded videos on their phones, quietly sharing them with friends and family. Before she even realized it, people outside the restaurant began asking about the girl who could play the piano with such emotion. Her music had moved not only those who were present but also strangers who had heard about it. The manager, who had once only noticed her as another hard-working staff member, now looked at her with a mix of pride and respect. He began asking her to play at special dinners more often. Sometimes a few private guests would request her by name, intrigued by the talent they had glimpsed. It was a strange feeling. She had gone from being invisible to suddenly being noticed, not for what she wore or the way she served, but for the music she could create. Even though recognition came, she remained humble. She did not let the praise change who she was. She still worked her shifts, still carried trays, still wiped tables, but now, each note she played felt like a piece of herself being shared with the world. Each time she sat at the piano, she remembered the long nights of practice, the dreams she had hidden, and the determination that had kept her going through difficult times. The more she played, the more confident she became. One evening, a guest approached her after a performance and said softly, "You have something special. Don't let it go. You should play more, maybe even professionally." She smiled, a little shyly, unsure how to respond. The thought of leaving the restaurant, stepping fully into the world of music, both excited and frightened her. Could she really do it? Could she really take this chance that life seemed to be offering? Her mother noticed the change first. She had always supported her daughter quietly, without asking for anything in return. When she saw her sitting at the piano at home, practicing late at night, she smiled through tears. "It's your gift," she said softly. "You were meant to share it. Don't be afraid." Those words gave her courage. If her mother believed in her, maybe it was time she believed in herself too. Soon, she was invited to play at more events, small gatherings at first, then larger ones, sometimes even in front of audiences she could never have imagined a few months earlier. Each time she felt the same mixture of fear and excitement. But she also felt a growing sense of purpose. Music was no longer just a secret passion. It was a path, a way to reach people, a way to live fully. People who had once dismissed her now came to listen. The wealthy guests who had expected nothing but polite background music were now astonished. They admired her skill, her courage, and the emotion she poured into each performance. She became a symbol of hidden talent, proof that greatness could be found in the most unexpected places. Despite all the attention, she never forgot why she had started playing in the first place. It was not for fame or recognition. It was for the love of music, for the feeling it gave her, for the chance to express everything she had held inside for so long. Each note she played was a reminder of her journey, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the dreams she refused to abandon. One day, an opportunity arrived that would change her life completely. A music school, impressed by the videos of her performances, reached out to her with an invitation. They wanted her to attend classes, learn from professional instructors, and even perform in a recital for students and teachers. It was a chance she had never thought possible. She hesitated at first. Leaving her job at the restaurant meant uncertainty. It meant taking a risk she had avoided for so long. But then she remembered the faces of the guests, the applause, and most importantly, the feeling she had while playing. It was undeniable. Music was her true calling. With her mother's encouragement, she decided to take the chance. Her first day at the music school was overwhelming. The halls were filled with people who had trained for years, students with polished skills and years of experience. She felt small at first, intimidated by the talent around her. But when she sat at the piano for her first lesson, everything changed. Her fingers moved with confidence, her hands remembered the songs she had loved for so long, and her heart guided each note. The teachers were amazed. They could see that her skill was natural, that her music carried something beyond technique. It carried soul, emotion, and life experience. They encouraged her to perform, to share her talent, and to continue developing her skills. Months passed and she improved quickly. Each day at the school she learned something new, grew stronger, and became more confident in her abilities. She also performed at small concerts organized by the school, gradually gaining experience in front of live audiences. But unlike before, this time she knew she was prepared. Each performance was no longer a test. It was a celebration of her journey, a tribute to every sacrifice and every dream that had led her to this moment. Meanwhile, the restaurant remained part of her life, though now in a different way. She returned occasionally, not as a waitress, but to perform at special events. Her former colleagues watched her with admiration. Some even admitted quietly that they had never truly understood her before. But now they did. She had shown them what determination and talent could achieve, and she had done it without losing her humility or kindness. Her music also began to touch people outside the restaurant and school. Videos of her performances were shared online, reaching audiences far beyond what she could have imagined. Comments poured in from people who were inspired, moved, and even comforted by her music. She realized that her gift was bigger than herself. It could bring joy, hope, and healing to others. Through all this, she never forgot her mother. Each new opportunity, each performance she shared quietly with her, holding her hand and letting her know that her dreams were now alive. Her mother's pride and support became the quiet foundation that kept her grounded, reminding her of where she came from and why she had started. Eventually, she was invited to perform at a large concert hall, her first major public performance outside of the restaurant. The thought terrified her, but also filled her with excitement. When she walked on stage that night, dressed simply but confidently, she could feel the weight of her journey behind her. The audience was full of strangers, but she felt no fear. She sat at the piano and let her music speak. From the first note, the room was silent. Every person listened, captivated by the emotion, the skill, and the story woven into each sound. Tears formed on some faces. Smiles appeared on others. When she finished, the applause was deafening. Standing ovations followed. In that moment, she realized that her life had truly changed. She was no longer just a waitress with a secret passion. She was a pianist, a performer, and most importantly, a person who had dared to follow her dreams despite every obstacle. After the concert, people came forward shaking her hand, asking about her story, praising her courage and talent. She smiled, remembering the long nights of practice, the years of struggle, and the simple moments when she had believed in herself quietly, even when no one else did. In the weeks and months that followed, her life continued to grow in ways she could never have imagined. She performed at larger venues, collaborated with other musicians, and even began teaching young students who wanted to learn piano. Each time she played, she remembered the restaurant where it all began, the humble place where she had first dared to sit at the piano in front of strangers and trust herself. The wealthy guests who had once been shocked by her talent now admired her as a symbol of possibility. She had shown them that greatness can appear anywhere, and that courage and passion matter more than wealth or status. But for her, the greatest reward was the simple joy of playing, of sharing her gift, and of knowing that she had finally found her place in the world. And so, what began as a quiet waitress carrying trays in a luxurious restaurant became a story of courage, talent, and transformation. She had walked to the piano one night unsure and nervous, and what followed changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed the moment, and for all the lives her music would touch in the years to come. Through all the challenges, the struggles, and the uncertainty, she had discovered one truth. Dreams do not die when life becomes hard. They wait patiently, quietly, for the moment when someone dares to reach for them. And when that moment comes, anything is possible.